Hello, everybody. It's great to see you all, and welcome to part number 8 of the Life Theory Lab lecture series. As you might know, this lecture series is part of the LIFE program, the educational program of the International Max Planck School we have here in Berlin and with some other educational institutions around the world. And this LIFE Lab lecture series is organized by Markus Berkel-Bergner, Inge Kruse, and Ulman Lindenberger. My name is Thorsten Pacho, and together with Markus, I'll be hosting the lecture today. It's a great pleasure, really, to have Iyad Rahwan, who is a director at the MPI in Berlin, here talking to us today. And he will speak about experiments in machine behavior, a very exciting topic. As you might know, as usual, we have 45 minutes for the talk and followed by about 30 minutes of discussion. And for the discussion, also as usual, the fellows and the students of the LIFE program have a priority to ask questions. But if you have a question in general, please indicate so by using the chat function of the webinar software, and Markus and I will moderate through the discussions afterwards. So before we turn to the introduction to our today's speaker, let me remind you that the session will be recorded. So please, for the LIFE fellows, if you prefer not to appear in the video, please switch off your video. And all of you, please switch off the microphone during the talk, because that will improve the quality. Okay, thanks Iyad again for being with us today, and Anna Thoma will present and introduce our speaker today.
Right. I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Iyad Rahwan as today's LIFE seminar speaker. He's the founder and director of the Center of Humans and Machines at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development. Previously to establishing his research group here in Berlin, Iyad Rahwan was a professor at the Media Lab at MIT. His work focuses on the intersection between computer science and human behavior. With his research, he seeks to answer questions not only about how machines shape human cognition and cooperation, but also how artificial intelligence impacts our society. He contributed fundamentally to the concept of machine behavior and led a research project on moral machines that collected decisions for millions of people worldwide, a sample size that most of us only dare to think of in our wildest dreams. I'm very much looking forward to his talk on machine behavior, a research agenda for a society permeated by artificial intelligence. So welcome, Iyad Rahwan, and the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you so much. I hope everybody can see the slides.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
I'm seeing some nods. That's good. So thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to present to this group of smart people. I want to talk today about the notion of machine behavior and some very early experiments that we're doing that pertain to machine behavior, and specifically in relation to cooperation, human cooperation with and through machines. And I'll explain what that means in a moment. So this is the overview of the talk. I will first talk about the problem of cooperating through machines. So if we want machines to exhibit a certain behavior, we need to first agree on what that behavior should be. And that could be a problem of cooperation, because we may not agree on what the right thing is to do for the machine. The second question is about how can we cooperate with a machine. So in this case, the machine is the cooperation partner that may or may not cooperate with us. And finally, I want to close with a much broader agenda than these two specific questions, which is about this notion of a behavioral study of machines. And hopefully, this will inspire people to take this behavioral perspective to help grow this notion and this field of machine behavior. So let's begin with cooperating through machines. And we take as a case study the question of autonomous cars. So today we have more than 1 million global traffic fatalities caused by traffic accidents. And most of them are caused actually by human error. So people are not paying attention, or they're drunk, or whatever. They're too fatigued. So which means that in principle, 90% of accidents could be avoided because if you could have a machine that doesn't get tired, doesn't get drunk, and is always paying attention on the road. But the problem, one of the challenges before we get there, before we have wide adoption of autonomous vehicles on the road, is that people are uncomfortable with the notion that a machine could make an ethical choice in a case of an unavoidable harm. So let's look at a very cartoonish scenario of what an accident might look like. Suppose this is a self-driving car. It's going to crash into a number of pedestrians. But suppose that the car can swerve and hit one person on the pavement in order to save, let's say, 5 people or 2 people. Should the car do this? Should the car be programmed with this behavior a priori? More interestingly, perhaps, is should the car be programmed to hit a wall, endangering its own passenger in order to minimize total loss of life or injury? So this is a kind of looks like a classic problem called the trolley problem, which is studied in philosophy but also in psychology. And the problem there is you're an external observer, and you should decide whether to pull a lever to move the trolley from one train track to another to kill 1 person instead of 5, which is the default option. And people have studied this trolley problem and many variants of it for maybe 2 decades now, at least. Now, the question here is a little bit different because we're thinking about, well, first of all, it's more realistic. It's no longer just a thought experiment. You could conceivably face these kinds of situations or something a bit more complex version of this situation. And also, there are the stakeholders in this case could be the person who's being sacrificed themselves. This is the case of a person who's purchased the car. So what we did is we ran a whole bunch of surveys with vignettes asking people about these questions and what they think, basically what they think should be done and what type of car they would be willing to get into, to buy. And when you ask them what should be done, they say it's very clear, always save more lives. This is a sample of American participants. But when you ask them which car would you buy, they would say, I would never buy a self-sacrificing car, but I want everybody else to. So there is this notion of there's a breakdown in cooperation, essentially, because people know what the right thing to do is for society, but they don't want to make this personal sacrifice to bring about this outcome. Which means that all the cars will have to be self-protecting of the passengers. And this kind of changes the problem from a problem of what is the ethical principle that governs the behavior of the machine in this scenario to as an ethical dilemma, and it morphs it into a social dilemma. How can we get, given that people agree on the ethical principle, kill fewer people, how can we get them to actually agree to pay this small personal cost of increased risk, personal risk, in order to bring about this outcome? And that's a social dilemma that looks something like the tragedy of the commons. It has the same signature. In the tragedy of the commons, you have, which was popularized by ecologist Hardin in the 60s, you have multiple farmers who are sharing a common land, that's public land, and they each bring some sheep, a certain number of sheep, and the sheep graze, and the grass rejuvenates, and everybody's happy. But every farmer has incentive to bring in more sheep. And if they do, it won't really impact the collective good because the land can afford to have one more sheep. But if every farmer does the same, you have too many sheep, and then the land will be dried out. And the same example can be found in overfishing, for example, when different fishermen or fishing companies can exceed their quotas as they catch fish, then the ecosystem cannot regenerate fast enough. So in this case, in the case of autonomous cars, the public good is safety rather than, let's say, fish or grass. And the incentive to deviate is to look after your own safety a little bit more. So the way you solve these things is by setting up quotas or some limits on the behavior of individuals. But when we asked our participants, would you support regulations that requires everybody to have a car that minimizes harm. So you're not the only person who is making this personal sacrifice by having the pro-social car. People basically said, in this case, I would not buy the car. I would rather stay with my own car. So there is, in this case, a different opt-out option. That means that if you try to solve the social dilemma using conventional methods, and people have an option to opt out of the whole system, you end up with something like a meta-ethical dilemma. Because if you force all the cars to minimize harm, consumers won't buy them. Therefore, you will not get the safety benefits of the self-driving cars. So we're in a situation where we may have to allow the cars to be more protective of their passengers if we want to accelerate adoption, and then switch to something like minimizing harm in total. But it all depends on the politics of the whole thing. It depends on whether we get more resistance from consumers who would not want to buy a car that doesn't improve their safety, whether we want to get resistance, whether we get resistance from citizens and people who represent cyclists and pedestrians and so on, who are interested in their own safety as well. And that's still an open question. But I think what we've done in this paper is we've basically identified some key psychological factors that may play a role in this dynamic. Now, these are obviously just about total number of these dilemmas. Only compare one group of people versus another group of people, basically different numbers. Would you save 5 people by killing 1 person, or would you save 3 people by killing 1 person, and so on. But we wanted to explore a situation in which there are more factors involved. So in the real world, you could have children, for example, or you could have a dog crossing the street that could be hit by a car. So we wanted to introduce more factors and to understand how the covariance of these factors influences the outcomes. So to do this, we built this website called The Moral Machine. And the website looks something like this. It shows you binary dilemmas and asks you to choose one of those unavoidable harm outcomes. So in this particular case, you have a car. The car is about to, it's on the left here. It's about to hit these 3 pedestrians and a dog, and they will die in this outcome. That's the default. The car could swerve and hit the barrier, killing the 1 passenger in the car. So should the car do this or not? Notice that we have a traffic sign here. It's red, so these people are crossing illegally. So this brings up lots of questions. Should you care about the life of the dog? Should you care that these people are not crossing legally? Should you prioritize pedestrians over passengers, or vice versa? Does the car have a duty to its owner, or does it have duty to minimizing harm, and so on? So what we did is we varied all of these factors: interventionism, the relation to the autonomous vehicle. Sometimes we're comparing 2 groups of pedestrians, for example, the legality, the legal complications involved, and then the types of characters involved. So these are factors that capture gender, age, life expectancy and health, species, total number of people, as well as social value. Like, would you prioritize a doctor, for example? These are all the characters involved in the experiment. So we were very fortunate that we got significant coverage from the media, both from traditional media sources like the New York Times and others, but also from new media sources like these YouTubers like PewDiePie and Jacksepticeye. These people it's a whole genre of entertainment that I was not really familiar with. I'm sure the listeners, the audience, are much more familiar with them, and that's a testament to my age, because these people are basically, they have millions of people, millions of followers, something like 80 million or 100 million followers, and they would watch videos and comment on them, and other people watch them. It's very meta in a sense, but it enabled us to, it really brought in a lot of traffic to the website, which we translated to 10 languages. And at the time of analysis, we had 4 million users, 40 million decisions on dilemmas, and 500,000 surveys. And this is really amazing, because the more machine, with this multifactorial design, you actually have 26 million possible dilemmas. So there's a very quick combinatorial explosion of possibilities that you can, which means you cannot study this with conventional methods. This is the global coverage of the data that we published last year, or a couple of years ago. You could see that it covers the entire world, and the map actually corresponds fairly well to the map of the lit world, where basically cities exist and population density is high. So a lot of the empty regions are just regions with, like the Amazon, for example, where there aren't people anyway. Now I want to share with you some of the results. So first is an exercise on individual scenarios, just to give you a sense of what the kinds of dilemmas that these scenarios evoke in people. This is a fairly easy case. You've got a car that's going to hit the barrier and kill 2 passengers, but it can swerve and kill 2 pedestrians. I would like to invite you to think, what would you do? What do you think the car should do? If you're advising the programmers of the car, what do you think they should program the car to do in this case? And this is the result from our data. More people would say the car should go straight. It could be for multiple reasons. It could be because that's the default, so no need to intervene. Or it could be because there's a preference to save pedestrians, because they've not chosen to be in the car. It's not their fault. This is a case with an empty car, so it's maybe going to pick up someone, and it's going to hit a child, but the car can swerve and hit an adult. What do you think should be done? Our sample shows that the majority of people would want the car to swerve, but still 27% of people would say that let the car keep going straight. This is a case where, with traffic lights, so again, an empty car that's going to kill 1 pedestrian. The car can swerve and hit another pedestrian who's crossing illegally. So do you think the car should hit the person who's crossing illegally to save this person who was going to die by default? I will show you here that a lot of people say the car should swerve. And the number is higher for countries like Germany, where there's a stronger sense of the importance of the traffic light than other countries, like, for example, where I come from. But then what happens when you have 2 people who are crossing illegally? What's more important for you now? Is it the abiding by the law and not punishing a person who's done nothing wrong? Or is it saving more lives? And this is where things start getting complicated. And that's an example of why co-varying these factors enables you to tease out the importance of different factors more accurately. So I'll show you some results now from the entire data set. So this is from the entire 40 million decisions. This plot shows, the way you interpret this plot is as follows. There's a kind of baseline probability that the thing on the left will survive in an accident. That's a dog, for example. And then what you see on the x-axis is the change in probability that this thing will survive if you swap it with the thing on the right. So for example, there's a baseline probability that a dog will die. If I switch the dog to a human, there is a 60% increase, 60% probability increase in the probability that the human will survive in the same scenario, averaging over all the other factors combined. Here's another example. So if I take 1 person and I add 1 person, so you're comparing 2 versus 1 people, or 3 people versus 2. So if there's 1 additional person, this is the increase in the probability of survival. This is 2 extra people, 3 extra people, and 4 extra people. And then here you can see the entire set, which may or may not surprise you. I mean, for us, for example, we expected that pedestrians, the importance of pedestrians being prioritized over passengers would be bigger than this effect. It's still significant. It's still kind of sizable in the conventional sense, but it's nowhere near the size of the human versus animal life, for example. You can see there are three groups. So these three groups of preferences, sparing humans, sparing more people, and sparing young people, are very strong preferences. Then you can see here this group of two, sparing people who are crossing legally, lawfully, which you may agree with, but then sparing higher status people, which you may not agree with. For example, sparing a business executive over a homeless person. And then the others are also there. They're also statistically significant, but not as strong. And there's definitely strong, a weak preference for inaction. It's not very strong. And we could have a whole philosophical debate about, should we use this? Of course, we shouldn't use this to implement policy, because some of these things are reasonable, some of them are just horrible and probably illegal. So because of the size of the data set that we have, we're able to conduct this same analysis, but on the level of countries, which enables us to both visualize these things, but also compute the distance between countries by basically using the effect sizes of these different factors as the vector and computing the distance between those vectors, which allows us to cluster the countries. And I'll show you this in a moment. So the first step, let's see now the preferences that I showed you earlier projected on this radar plot. So you can see here, for example, that sparing humans is the strongest preference, and so on. Now, this is Germany in comparison to the global average, and you can see some really interesting deviations. There's some agreement, like Germans care about saving women just as much as the rest of the world over men. But they do have a strong, much higher preference for inaction, for not intervening. They also have a lower preference for saving higher status people. They still prefer to save higher status people on average, but much less than the global average. And they do have a stronger preference for saving humans over animals. And this is China. Again, you can see that China does, agrees with Germany on many things, but disagrees wildly on some. For example, sparing pedestrians is much weaker. Sparing young people is much weaker. Again, they still prefer to spare young people, but much less than the global average. And also they're less utilitarian, so they care less about just saving more people. But they do care more about the law. And of course, you can come up with your own theories about why this is the case. And there's a website where that we built. If you Google more machine results, you could see interactive. You can create these kind of plots interactively. But now I want to show you the clustering. So this is a dendrogram that we created by clustering the countries based on the similarities of their preferences. And basically this clustering happens in a completely bottom-up fashion. So the structure of the trees is completely bottom-up. The coloring comes from a well-known classification of countries that comes from anthropology. So it's like it's expert-based, it's done by hand. And you could see we have broadly a southern cluster, a western cluster, and an eastern cluster. And you have structure within those clusters too. But there are some interesting things if you start zooming in. For example, the western cluster shows you this kind of separation between the Commonwealth countries all bunch up together. You can see here Protestant countries seem to be closer to each other than the rest. You could see in the Eastern cluster a lot of Islamic and Confucian countries. And in the Southern cluster, you could see there are two subclusters. One of them captures most of South America. And what's interesting here is that Spain is not actually in this cluster. So it doesn't seem to be driven by linguistic factors, the way that the problems are described in Spanish. But instead, you'll be able to see Spain in the Western cluster next to Portugal, which I think is really fascinating. Now there is an elephant in the room, which is, will any of this even matter? Because the cars will never face these kinds of scenarios. And I just want to share with you a quick kind of conceptual generalization of this. So I do think that the trolley problem, or this kind of dilemma, is relevant in the statistical sense. So imagine this car. You're driving in the car. There's a bike lane on your left, and there's a truck on your right. You might maybe subconsciously move a little bit further from the big truck because it's a big, scary, noisy thing. You don't want to hit it. Or you could notice the cyclist and say, I'm a cyclist. I'm very conscious of how endangering them. I'm going to get further from the cyclist. You're not doing anything illegal. You're not facing an accident scenario. You're making very micro decisions, micro level decisions about where to stay within the lane. And in one instance, it doesn't look like a dilemma, but over millions or billions of these instances, you might slightly increase statistical likelihood of one type of accident or another. Maybe you're more likely to hit the truck in expectation with a slightly increased probability, or you're more likely to hit the cyclist. And indeed, this kind of logic is already part of patents filed for, by companies like Google for making decisions by autonomous vehicles. For example, should you overtake this truck that's stuck at the light, you calculate, and this is a figure from the patent filing, is a risk penalty that you calculate based on the probability of different events and the risk magnitude of the cost. And they include things like getting hit by oncoming traffic or vehicle, losing information that's important, which has its own cost as well, and so on. Hitting a pedestrian who runs in the middle of the road, and so on. So these things aren't so far-fetched. So that's what we spoke about so far, is how can humans cooperate or agree about how to program a machine. And as we can see, they don't always agree. The second question is, how can humans cooperate with machines? And is this something even that can be studied? Now, there's a lot of research on AI that's been defined by what's called zero-sum games. So if you think of all of the major accomplishments for AI that have captured public attention, you see things like beating Garry Kasparov in chess by Deep Blue, or beating the world champion in poker, or beating the world champion in Go, like what DeepMind recently did, and so on. And all of these games are zero-sum games in which one party wins and the other party loses. And at best, there is a draw. But these games have a particular structure, which makes the challenge more about managing the combinatorial explosion of the game, but not about strategizing in the sense of finding win-win solutions. Of course, there is a lot of research on human-machine collaboration. For example, this is Judy Shah from MIT in her lab with this robot that's supposed to help workers in their jobs while being safe and not whacking them in the face. But these are robots that are designed to be collaborative. So in a sense, they are subservient to the human. They're kind of slaves. I'm interested in this case, which is there's a human and a machine, and the machine maybe belongs to somebody else. So I don't have authority over this machine. I don't have control over this machine. But there may be an opportunity for me to collaborate with the machine if we can establish this mutual cooperation. And the question is, how do we study this? And the canonical way of studying these problems is through a problem called the prisoner's dilemma. There are many ways of explaining it, but this is the quickest that I found. There are two players. The two players will act simultaneously. They will take an action that, suppose each player has a resource like this block, okay, a blue square and a red square. But suppose that the square is valued more by the other player. So you can either keep the square or you can give it to the other player. And the best scenario is I give you the square, you give me the square, and we both have double the value, right? So I can double your square and you can double my square. But there is a temptation for me to keep my square and take your squares too. And that would be defection. You have the same temptation. So in equilibrium, basically we don't cooperate and we are both worse off. It looks something like the tragedy of the commons was the social dilemma that I explained earlier. And there's thousands of papers in behavioral economics and in psychology and in biology studying this, how species, organisms, and especially humans solve this problem and find sustainable cooperation. And there's lots of mechanisms for doing this, like punishment, reputation, and so on. What we did was the first kind of extensive study of human-machine cooperation in this prisoner's dilemma game and other games. So what we did is we picked an algorithm called S++, which was developed by a former colleague of mine, Jacob Crandall, who's an expert on reinforcement learning. It's a meta-reinforcement learning algorithm based on expert algorithms. I'll explain this in a moment. And it's able to play generalized repeated games. So not just a prisoner's dilemma, but a whole class of games, stochastic games. It has some properties. So it's engineered to be nice in the sense that it never initiates defection if you play multiple rounds of this prisoner's dilemma. It's lenient, so which means that it's robust to small deviations. You know, if you make a mistake, it won't over punish you. And it's forgiving, so it returns to cooperation after punishing defectors. And it has, but most importantly, it has a very important property that makes it amenable to experimental study with humans. If you look at, we've done a comparison of S++ with some of the state-of-the-art reinforcement learning algorithms that are available out there for playing games. And this is in self-play, so the algorithm plays against itself. You can see that a lot of algorithms will converge to mutual defection, so they will not cooperate, either in the quickly or eventually they will reach mutual defection. There are some algorithms that converge to cooperation, so they find the cooperative equilibrium and they start cooperating together, but they do so after 10,000 rounds of play. So they do too much exploration and then too many mistakes before they find cooperation. S++ is the exception in that it can learn cooperative behavior within 10 rounds or so, which makes it feasible to run experiments with humans. So the details of the algorithm S++ are really beyond the scope of this talk, but I just want to give you a high level. There are basically many small algorithms that are analyzing the game and then computing some kind of potential game from different strategies. You prune those, you select one of them, and then you use it to play. So it's like having, that's why it's called the meta algorithm, because there's basically different perspectives on how to play the game in your mind. And then at any given point, you take one perspective. You say, okay, I'm going to be nice now. And then you play nice, and then you change your strategy and so on. So you follow the selected expert, and then you update your aspiration. So every other perspective is being updated simultaneously. And then you do this, you repeat this process again. And what we've done is we've then run experiments not just with S++, but also with S#, which is S++ with the ability to generate and interpret signals. So these are pre-programmed responses that includes things like threats, promises, suggested actions, and things like that. Like if you do this, I'll do that, and so on. And this is a finite state machine that describes how this algorithm generates these messages from its internal state. And I want to share with you now the results from the first paper we published on this. This is over 50 rounds of play in the prisoner's dilemma, the game of chicken, and the alternator game, which are coordination games with different properties. And as you can see, if no communication, this is human-human play first. If humans cannot communicate, they don't really cooperate much on the prisoner's dilemma, and they don't do very well on these coordination games. If they can communicate, they typically do better, especially on the prisoner's dilemma, which is our interest here. And they do even better on coordination games. Now let's see humans versus S#. This is or S++, the algorithm, reinforcement learning algorithm. You can see that the algorithm starts low, and you can see there's a kind of bias. People don't want to cooperate with the algorithm at the beginning, but eventually they do realize the algorithm is a cooperator. and the algorithm is able to extract some cooperative behavior from them. But it's better able to do so if it can communicate with them. And finally, you could see here that when the algorithm plays with itself, it's actually even better able to cooperate towards the end. And you could speculate about what that means, about whether the machines will eventually want to play with us or just do their own thing. We can now start exploring the behavior of this algorithm, so and how it's being perceived by human participants. So first of all, in terms of intelligence, clear intent, useful signals, it's almost indistinguishable from the human. Obviously, the human is not using full natural language. Now here you could see how many people thought it was human. So people were not able to guess very much. It was basically 50-50. They weren't sure if humans were humans, but they had better ability to detect bots. But when communication is possible, they do slightly better in the case of humans. But the bots also appear more human-like, so it becomes harder to tell. This is the behavior of the algorithm itself. If you look at, how was the algorithm able to achieve this cooperation, and you could see that what's interesting is that the algorithms were not using the same kind of communication behaviors. For example, they were giving much less praise than the humans. The humans were complimenting each other all the time, even though they were not cooperating as much. You can see the algorithm is using more hate speech and threats. Also, it was also using more planning utterances. So it was like suggesting specific behavioral sequences to the human. Now, another question we asked ourselves during that study is, well, what if people played with the bot, but they didn't know that they were playing with the bot? Should the bot reveal its true identity? And this question is kind of relevant. It became very relevant in the case of Google Duplex. So in 2018, Google released this basically voice assistant, and it was just extremely human-like. So it was making similar kind of mistakes in speech that a human would do, similar kind of hesitations, and there was different perspectives on this. There was some reaction. The Washington Post wrote, should the algorithm be required to tell people that it's a machine if it's so human-like? The Guardian published an article saying Google's deceitful AI assistant must will identify itself as a robot. That was Google's official response to the concerns. And most recently, by the way, this algorithm is actually deployed. It's calling businesses. I think it is identifying itself as a bot, and it's checking things like toilet paper and so on. Do you have toilet paper? And so on. So it can even check for things like, how many people do you have? Is your restaurant fully booked or not? So there's a question about whether we should, in general, require machines to reveal their identity. So what we did is, in a follow-up paper published last year, is we asked the following question. What if we have bots that play with people and appear, and we tell people they're bots versus we tell people they're humans? And what if we told people that the humans were also bots? How would this shape the initial bias or the initial propensity to cooperate at the beginning with the AI and with the human? And how will it shape the long-term behavior, the cooperation behavior? So you can see that at the beginning, there's only a slightly lower probability, it's not statistically significant, of cooperating with the bot in round 1. But this is in round 2 after the cooperation in the initial round. So the bot was nice, the bot cooperated. People were less likely to cooperate with it in the next round. Maybe they thought, this is a stupid bot, I can exploit it. And also, if the bot did not cooperate, they were also less likely to cooperate with it. Maybe they thought, this is a stupid bot that doesn't cooperate, and I'm going to, again, not cooperate with it. And this is what happens in round 3. Again, consistently, people were less likely to cooperate with the bot, regardless of the sequence of actions. So in general, what we found is participants were always more likely to cooperate with the human, with a purported human, regardless of the partner's decision history. And this effect was significant in round 2 and 3. Now, when we look at the long-term dynamics of this interaction, you see here that this plot shows you a situation where the associate is human. So humans are playing with other humans, but if they know that they're humans, the initial propensity to cooperate with them is higher, and then it goes down slowly, which is kind of standard finding in prisoner's dilemma, repeated prisoner's dilemma without communication. But if you tell them it's a bot, they cooperate less with it in the beginning, and that worsens even more. And now this is a case where you're playing with a bot. But if we told you that it's a human, you're much more likely to cooperate with it. But if we tell you it's a bot, okay, so it is a bot, and we tell you that it's a bot, you're less likely to cooperate with it as well. And we even try to de-bias people by saying, look, this is a bot, but try to treat it like a human, and that doesn't do anything. But one thing is clear from this case, is that the worst thing you could do is a human who's pretending to be a bot. And that's the lowest outcome, the worst outcome. And the best thing you could do is a bot, that's admittedly programmed to be nice and cooperative, that pretends to be a human. So there seems to be a trade-off between the efficiency of cooperation in this case and the transparency of the bot's identity. And then, how do you resolve this? That's a question for society to figure out. We've only identified the bias and the trade-off. So there may be cases where, for example, maybe people calling a customer service agent to help them with, a problem with their electricity. Maybe people will be more abusive if they knew that they were not talking to a real human being whose feelings they could hurt. So should we then require bots to reveal their identity or to pretend that they are people in order to maintain civility? I don't know the answer to this question, but I think it's a fascinating question for society. And lastly, one of the interesting features of working with a bot versus a human is you could look inside its head. So this particular algorithm has an aspiration level, which captures its expectation about what utility it can extract from the interaction. And as you can see here, this is over around the average aspiration level of the bots. You could see that they learn over time to expect less from humans, especially in the in the transparent condition. So when the humans know that they are bots, but they seem to expect much more from each other, and for good reason, as we have seen. So let's close with the third part of the talk, which is about the research agenda on machine behavior. And I think what we're doing is really baby steps in this broader research agenda about machine behavior that we outlined in a review published last year, together with computer scientists, but also psychologists, economists, biologists, political scientists, anthropologists, and so on. And if you think about questions like that pertain to the behavior of algorithms, for example, does an algorithm create filter bubbles? Does an algorithm discriminate against a racial group when it's granting parole? Does an autonomous vehicle drive aggressively? These are all questions that can be explored behaviorally. You could explore them from an engineering perspective, but you can also explore them from a purely behavioral perspective. Does an autonomous weapon respect necessity and proportionality, for instance, in its use of force, like you would expect a human soldier would? Do algorithms manipulate markets? Do they increase systemic risk by colluding, for instance? Online dating, do the algorithm use features they're not supposed to use, or do they amplify or reduce homophily in humans? And same thing, questions about conversational robots like Amazon Alexa or Siri. Do they promote products to children? Do they affect collective behavior in some way? Again, you can explore these things behaviorally in addition to just from the engineering perspective. So in a way, it's a new way for us to also certify that if machines are ethical, rather than checking their source code. We don't certify that humans are ethical by checking their brains, although that's, maybe if Ullman Lindenberger continues his agenda, then eventually we will. But for now, we can't do this, and instead we rely on human behaviors in order to certify and verify human behavior, like the ethicality and the compliance with norms and laws. So if you think about it, we're kind of at this very early stage of studying the machines, just like we were at the early stage of studying the animal behavior in the mid-50s, 1950s. So you can think of this, machine as a mouse, and instead of inspecting the code of the mouse, which is maybe akin to like doing neuroscience or something like that, but you could do behaviorism. You could do behavioral experiments in which you could vary stimulus, like temperature, and measure behavior, like sleep. You could imagine doing something like this with a machine, where you, in a very controlled manner, in a controlled environment, you could study the behavior of this machine. And that's kind of what we did in something like this cooperation games, because we did these lab-based experiments. And if you could develop a lot of these experimental tests, then you could, for a given domain, you could take new algorithms, you could subject them to this metric, this test, and pick the ones that perform best. It's actually an old idea that goes back all the way to Herb Simon, who's influenced the Max Planck Institute for Human Development significantly over the decades. He wrote a book called The Sciences of the Artificial, in which he distinguished between natural science, which is knowledge about natural objects and phenomena like ants and trees and so on, with artificial science, which is knowledge about artificial objects like machines, institutions, and markets. Of course, you could study individual machine behavior, but you could also study emergent behavior from these machines collectively interacting. And most importantly, you could study the hybrid human-machine collective behavior that emerges as we interact with them. This field is kind of the field of machine behavior is related to other fields in the following sense. I see it as interacting as something that lies at the intersection of the engineering of AI, so the science of building machines, and the science of studying behavior, just applying behavioral science to algorithms and machines. And of course, it impacts it impacts the legal discussion and the ethical discussion about regulation and so on, and ethical design by providing quantitative scientific evidence. And the final thing we did in the paper, which I won't get into in great depth here, is we tried to identify the fundamental questions of the science of machine behavior. And we took inspiration from Nicholas Tinbergen, who won the Nobel Prize for the foundation of animal behavior together with Carl von Frisch and Konrad Lorenz. Tinbergen basically classified the fundamental questions of the study of biological organisms into 4 questions based on the type of question and the object of study. So you could study the static view and the dynamic view over time, and you could take a proximate view or an ultimate evolutionary view. So you could discuss why a particular behavior, what are the mechanisms that cause it, but also what is the function, what is the adaptive value of this behavior to a particular organism, or in this case, a particular machine. You can also study the dynamic view. How does this behavior develop? Is it through machine learning, the training or the programming that took place, or is it through the interaction with the environment? Alexa is interacting with children and learning things about them, and that influences its behavior. And finally, the evolutionary forces that act on these things, of course, which include market forces as well, in the case of machines. So in summary, we spoke about cooperating through machines, human cooperation through machines. And the 2 main lessons here is that programming AIs gives rise to public goods games, public goods kind of social dilemmas. And there are cultural differences to take into account as we evaluate, in ethical values that may be important to recognize as we try to reach cooperative agreement on how these machines should behave. in terms of cooperating with machines, we saw that emergent voluntary human-AI cooperation is feasible, but I've showed also that there are trade-offs involved. For example, the trade-off between transparency and efficiency. And finally, there seems to be a time. This seems to be a time for a new science of machine behavior, in which AI is the object of behavioral study. I think that computational social scientists, or social scientists, behavioral scientists with strong computational training, are especially well equipped to help with this endeavor. So I'll just close with this slide, which shows the papers that I've discovered today, and also to acknowledge all of my collaborators, and there are so many with whom whose help was absolutely essential to making this project possible. And thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take some questions and have interesting discussions.
Thank you, Iyad, so much for a very inspiring talk and a very nice overview of your research program. We already have a question by Anna. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for the talk. So I was wondering, have you ever thought about how results on human cooperation change? Children from this time have grown up and turned into this bot interaction their entire life. Why adults in different times? So for me, for example, interacting with a bot usually very annoying because it didn't work well or something. So I'm wondering, what's your take on that?
So if you could just clarify a little bit, because I lost some of the question in the quality of the sound was low. But is the question about the long-term development of the interaction between humans and
no, more if you think you will still have the same results in, I don't know, 10 or 15 years from now, when the then adults will have had more experience growing up with interacting with bots?
Yes, that's a very good question. I mean, obviously things are changing fast. I'm not working on like the life course myself, but I do think there are fascinating questions. Already today, you see young people have very different disposition towards technology, very different norms in terms of privacy. They don't care about privacy as much. They're very happy to trade privacy for utility, and it'll be interesting to see how this shapes their behavior as they interact with intelligent machines over time. But the intelligent machines are also learning more about us. So they're becoming better at recognizing our intent, our emotional state, by analyzing our videos, our likes on Facebook, our browsing behavior. All kinds of things, we're being profiled in so many ways, and there are markets for sharing a lot of this data and these profiles. So, and they're just getting better at just understanding humans in general as well. And that's a technology prediction problem. It's really hard to predict how good they will be. But both of these, our own evolution as users of technology, but also the evolution of the machine itself are going to both interact to shape, what will a 10-year-old today, how will they treat an algorithm when they're 80, right? What sort of relationship will they have with? It's really hard to predict, and I think science fiction is the best place to start thinking about this.
Thank you.
So Natasha has next question, please.
Yes, thanks very much for the talk. It was really interesting, and I think that implementing these ethical, moral decisions into autonomous vehicles will be really hard, because the car industry definitely has, interest that buyers will buy the cars. But if it would be possible to implement the results, would it be recommended to customize it depending on the countries, because it shows that much different? And would it be feasible? And
good question. Thank you. I think it's feasible. I think it's already here. Different countries have different speed limits. They have different rules about driving next to schools. For example, another like very clear example is, you know, these, they call them bull bars, and in Australia they call them a roo bar, which is like a metal bar in the front of the car that you put for additional protection in case you hit like an animal, for example. Now, if you have these and you hit another car, you're much more likely to harm them than yourself. So they are kind of, they change the risk distribution. And as a result, they are banned in Germany. They're banned in the UK. I think they're banned in most of Europe, but they're not banned in the US. So different countries have chosen to solve this trolley problem essentially differently. They value different things, like the person's right to protect themselves is more important than the other person's right. You know, maybe they should buy more, like a bigger car themselves, or maybe get one of those bars themselves on the car. So these cultural differences are already kind of being reflected, I think, in the regulations. And I don't see a reason why they wouldn't be reflected in the behavioral features of the car, as opposed to just the physical features of the car and of the roads. So it's possible. Now, whether you should take, you know, now that doesn't justify that we should use the, you know, people's opinions to implement the rules. I think they are input to the rules, but there would be clear violations of fundamental rights sometimes. For example, if you say the cars should overrun homeless people who don't have a special, you know, insurance card that they, you know, chip that they carry with them, which protects them from accidents or something like that.
Thank you very much.
Michael is the next question.
Yes, thanks very much for your talk, Iyad. One phenomenon that has gained a lot of public interest in recent times is the spread of misinformation online. There's been a finding that was particularly interesting to lifespan psychologists, which is that people in the age group of 60 plus shared 7 times as many information from fake news sources than the youngest age group. So you, as someone coming from a machine behavior background, what do you think? How can we as researchers contribute towards an agenda that really focuses on promoting truth and democracy online?
Great question. Yeah, I think it's really tough. So I think we could approach this problem from different angles, right? One of them is diagnosis. So this is what you said. You know, first establishing which groups of users are more likely to share fake news in the first place. Maybe if teenagers share fake news, it's not so much a threat to democracy because they're not voters anyway. But people above 60 are voters, and therefore their opinions do matter, and if they're misinformed, that's a problem. Second question now I would ask is, why are they doing that? Is it because they are less able to cognitively differentiate between true and fake news? Or is it because they become more conservative, which is a thing, you know, it's another pattern that we're familiar with. As people grow older, they become less radical, more conservative. And it seems that more conservatives are, on average, in the US, more likely to share fake news. At least I think from the vague recollection I have of studies. So is it because they're sharing things that agree with them? You know, so what is the mechanism that's actually causing this? I think that's the next step. And once you identify the mechanism, then we might be in a better position to say, you know, do we need better information tools that help them? You know, if they want to share only true news, then providing them with better cues may be the way. But if they actually don't care about sharing true news, they just care about sharing a particular perspective, and they're doing selection bias on purpose, then that's not the way to solve the problem. And maybe we need another approach, maybe some kind of counter campaign of information that allows them to, it creates cost, maybe, for example, personal cost for sharing fake news, and all sorts of other things you could think about. But I think we're very far from knowing what the cause of the problem is, and therefore what might be a viable solution. And maybe, you know, maybe there's no solution to how we turn when we grow older, you know, in terms of our politics. I don't know.
Thank you.
We have another question from the fellows. Sonia, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thanks a lot for this super interesting talk. I was just wondering about implementation of the results that you got on these ethic dilemmas, and also like about these norms in different countries you were talking about. I'm just thinking how these results can be implemented, for example, in cars, in a way that, for example, in some for these questions, you have maybe 55 and 45% of the answers for different options. I'm just wondering, is that enough to be implemented like as a rule as such, and what is the norm that we should kind of stick to when we want to implement this in an actual autonomous car? And for example, also in talking about the rules for different countries, what is happening when, for example, a car from France is coming to Germany, so like which rules then should be followed, and who is going to decide about that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think you know, we get asked this question a lot, and in some cases there's an assumption that we're doing public polling about how to program the cars, and that's definitely not the case. So I don't think, you know, if it's like saying, let's take a vote on, you know, the death penalty for a particular individual or a particular group of people. I think that wouldn't be right. I think what we're doing is we're collecting public opinion as one input to the legislative process, which, you know, is not really our expertise. So at some point, regulators and legislators are going to think about rules for programming cars. But also car makers are going to think about the rules, and it's useful for them to know what the public thinks, because sometimes there is tension between the two. So for example, as far as I know, the only country that produced guidelines for self-driving cars is Germany. There was a commission created by the Ministry of Transport. They created some guidelines, and they have like engineers and lawyers and ethicists on the commission. And they suggested things like you cannot, the car cannot distinguish, cannot favor any particular group in terms of allocating risk based on personal features such as age or gender or status. Now, what we found in our in our data is that people do say cars should favor women, you know, to some extent. Cars should definitely favor children to a great extent. And cars should favor people with high status, you know, and fairly strong preference there that was expressed. Now, you might say, well, the public thinks cars should save children, should prioritize children, and maybe this is a case where public disagrees with the recommendations, and maybe you revise the recommendations because you realize that, you know, people don't think kids should be held to the same standard of like behavior on the road as adults. So that's a case where we might revise the recommendations. But then there is another case where we should ignore the public. You know, if the public thinks the life of a business person is more important than the life of a homeless person, we say, well, the law says you can't do that. So I don't care how many people think that. That's illegal in the discussion. So I think regardless, in both cases, it provides us with a lens for potential places, you know, of tension, and this tension may be different in different countries, obviously. So I don't know if this answers the question, but I think it sheds light on some interesting.
That answers my question. Yeah, we're just thinking about, so your idea is that this norm should be defined by each country themselves. Yeah. Sounds like a good idea. Thank you.
Okay, we'd now like to open the floor to the rest of the audience, and there is already a question by Jagmeet Kanwal. Please.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I was just curious in the discussion on the cars, whether they should swerve or go straight. There can be other options of slowing down or swerving halfway and maybe hitting the corner of the barrier, and so on. And so as humans, we actually process not in a binary fashion, but probably go through a lot of options before taking an action. And so I was wondering how useful is this exercise of just giving two choices, and is that feasible to actually put in a lot more options into the decision-making process?
Okay, thank you for asking the question, because it's also very common. First of all, I don't think humans are able to process anything in a situation like this. When an accident happens, people just either slam the brake and hope for and close their eyes and hope for the best, or they just turn the wheel, away from whatever is in front of them. And so I would say accidents today are not this premeditated, thoughtfully kind of considered situations. But with cars that are able to process the situation thousands or millions of times per second, we have the luxury to be able to process the situation and rethink behavior multiple times ahead of an accident. Now, so this is the first thing. Second thing, obviously, in real life, accidents will be this. The car will be facing distributions of outcomes. There will be eventually probabilities. There's uncertainty about what the things are. So maybe you're 90% certain that this is a child, but it could be something else, or 50% certain that it's a dog, but it might be something else. There's also uncertainty about what these things are going to do. Is this person going to stop or going to continue walking? There's uncertainty about what other cars are going to do. Uncertainty about how my brakes are going to work. How wet is it on the road, and so on. So there's so much uncertainty, and the car is going to, simultaneously, localize itself and predict all of this outcome. So I imagine it would look more like a probabilistic sort of distribution. That then once you multiply that with value, whatever value is, then you get a more smooth sort of set of outcomes, distribution of outcomes, and then you behave accordingly, and maybe you revise along the way. Now, that would be extremely complicated to replicate in a simple experimental study that 4 million people might engage with. So we had to take a trade-off between something that's more realistic. I think you have to go really far to make it really realistic and not a toy, and something that's simple that anybody can understand in a few seconds. Just look at it and say, okay, I know what you're trying to do here, and this is my opinion. And we erred for we went for the latter, and which is actually a very common approach in psychology of this type of judgment. And it enables us to force people to just consider two choices and not kind of hope for something else. And once you introduce probabilities, people start distorting those probabilities in other ways. There's all sorts of other cognitive biases that enter the situation. And we did not want, at least this early research, to be contaminated, let's say, by these complexities. So we wanted to start simple. And of course, we hope other people will follow up with further studies that look more realistic. And from what people have been doing so far, that have explored some more variations that are a little bit more realistic, it seems that things don't fundamentally change, at least.
Okay, let me actually also ask a question. One result that I found very interesting was this divergence in cooperation behavior as a function of whether you have two humans playing with each other or one computer basically with a human, where he found to some extent higher cooperation rates. And I was wondering what exactly the source of this higher cooperation rate is. I mean, it reminded me to some extent of a debate we had in the judgment decision-making sciences about 40, 50 years ago, where we had this discussion, which is better, actuarial or mechanistic judgment or clinical judgment, where it was found that one huge advantage of computers or of machines is that they have less error. And is that also one of the contributors to this higher cooperation rates, that computers or machines make less errors in implementing a particular cooperation strategy? And of course, then this there might be escalating behaviors following from judgment or decision error. Is that also behind that, or is it actually a substantial difference in the decision strategy of the machine?
I mean, this it's a difficult question. So I think this particular machine is designed to be. It's inspired by research on the evolution of cooperation and behavioral cooperation experiments in general. So it's hard to really disentangle. This. It's not an algorithm that learns cooperation completely from scratch, like AlphaZero, for example. Playing Go from scratch. It was so it's more like AlphaGo, where it's doing some learning on the fly, but also has kind of built-in biases and propensities that are part of its programming. And it's very hard to kind of disentangle those two, at least for this particular algorithm. But more broadly, I think we have to acknowledge the simplicity of the task. The real-world human cooperation doesn't look like this. This is, again, a simplification for the lab to allow us to control things a little bit more carefully with these games. But in the real world, people are reading each other's faces and all kinds of body language cues and who knows what else. They're looking at maybe even homophilic signals, like does this person look like an in-group or an out-group member, and so on. So there's a lot that can get into it, and I think true human-machine cooperation will have to explore that, maybe with humanoid robots that are very sophisticated. And finally, I think there's lots of things that maybe, like even if you look at just the results we saw, and say, well, what can explain this? Is maybe because people are using the fact that this is a human as a signal for, maybe the human is an in-group member and the robot is an out-group member. Maybe they have a particular theory of mind of how the bot behaves, and that may be incorrect. And maybe it was corrected a little bit in the experiment, so there was a little bit of an uptick. But when robots are out in the world, we will have much more experience interacting with them, so we'll form much more complex and sophisticated theory of their minds. So we don't know, right? So all of this will have to wait. But I would say that for now, surely there are biases, maybe they're temporary, until these things become really part of our lives, and then we need to do more experiments and more studies that are more ecological.
Thank you. There's more questions from the audience, and the next question is by Ulman Lindenberger.
Hi, Iyad, can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Okay. My question is very closely related to Thorsten Pachur's question. So I was fascinated by S++ and S#, especially when the humans thought that they were playing with a human and not with S#, and were engaging in cooperative behavior, and you basically got the best cooperative results. So I do understand the great value of looking at machines basically from the outside, what you call machine behavior. And at the same time, I wonder, based on these results, whether machines, if properly programmed, also carry the potential of producing better humans. And I just, especially from a developmental perspective, that is, I just was struck by the fact that this machine, if you wish, got the most cooperative behavior out of the human. And then you already answered Thorsten and said, well, this was actually a machine with some priors, and it was programmed to have perhaps a cooperative bias. But I think the question I have, is there also a big field in making sure that the way we program these bots and all these agents that will surround us and already are surrounding us, basically get the best out of us rather than the worst out of us?
That's a great question, Ulman. I think that maybe I should give you an example. There was a recent study published just earlier this year by Nicholas Christakis and some colleagues at Yale, He's a member of our advisory board at the Institute. And it's titled something like "Vulnerable Machines Promote Cooperation Among Humans" or something like this. And it was basically a robot that's not super intelligent or anything, but it was working on a task with a group of people. And it basically, when it made mistakes, it made this kind of vulnerability statements. So it would like say, I know my life is tough, or I just messed this up, and so on. And it was kind of expressing weakness. And it's known from from the literature that this type of behavior makes people more trusting, because you express vulnerability, and there was a greater camaraderie in the group. So together with Jacob Crandall and Jean-François Bonafont, we wrote a commentary on the paper titled "Machines as Social Catalysts." And basically the idea is we think there's a great potential for machines to elevate human interaction by being kind of members, somehow. Maybe you could imagine them using more polite language, for example. If Alexa uses polite language, then maybe children become more polite. But there's, and that's so. But I think there are risks going in the opposite direction, because these chatbots can also make people feel like there's no consequence, because they can't hit you back if you insult them. But if you insult another child in the playground, you might get punched. So I think there are forces going in both directions. On one hand, there's opportunities for these machines to make us worse, just by virtue of them being machines, or by if that was somehow profit maximizing for them. But they could also make us better, potentially, if we engineer them that way. And I think it's an opportunity for us to, as a society, to think about how to use behavioral science to engineer those machines in the more positive way.
Thanks.
Okay, we have another question by Untitled, please.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so I keep it short. It seems to me that humans have a fairly good intuition about causes and effects, and it seems crucial for interaction in general, and especially for moral interactions and decisions. Do you think that we need to teach machines a similar causal model of the world? Can we, and if so, how?
I mean, you're asking basically if we can solve AI, right? It's an open question. So can you make it more specific?
Yeah, do you think it is necessary to have like this causal mindset of machines? So do we have to impose this idea of humans, how we do something and something happens? Do we think it is a crucial task for AI to implement that? Because in my mind, it's not that all machine learning engineers do impose that idea of the world onto their algorithms.
Yeah, I think it's very task dependent. So it really depends on what you want the machine to do. So if the machine is just like a thermostat doesn't need to understand what causes the weather to change, as long as it can detect changes in the temperature and can react appropriately. So there are many cases where machines can perfectly fulfill their function without having causal models of anything. Reactive behavior, you could build very sophisticated robots or swarms of robots that have no theory of mind whatsoever, purely reactive behavior. And that can go a long way, but maybe for some tasks, I think it's important to have a causal model. If you want to cooperate, if you want to work with a human and try to understand the intent of the human as they perform a task and support them, I think it might be important to have a causal model, at least of that specific domain. And in terms of ethics, again, I think it depends. You could make a machine ethical without having it understand, what harm is and what causes harm and things like this. Maybe situations where you want to do that, but I think an autonomous car doesn't have to, as long as it has the right sort of distribution of parameters to optimize, right? So you can convert it to an optimization problem and you're fine. So I think it really depends on the task. I think one thing that does become an important question is, well, okay, so what is it that the machine should optimize though? So as soon as there are trade-offs between one thing and another, like trade-offs in the moral machine or trade-offs between the usability of a conversational bot and its impact on the language that the children use, for example, then I think it gets complicated. And then we have financial interests and concerns of parents as consumers, but also consumer protection groups and so on. Then it gets complicated, and then it becomes more politics than engineering. And I think that's being increasingly recognized now.
Thank you.
It's great. We have a very lively discussion. We're already running a bit over time, but let's have one final question by Maria Burcato, please.
Hello.
Hello, Maria.
Hi. Yeah. My question is, Ray Kurzweil's predictions around self-driving hint at the idea that manual driving may be phased out by the 2030s and potentially made illegal to drive on public roads. And I was wondering what your thoughts and predictions were yourself.
I have zero predictions about when we'll have autonomous cars.
Okay.
I don't work on them actually.
Gotcha.
Okay, let's close the discussion here. Iyad, thanks so much for sharing your vision and your research program to the live program. It was great to have you. And next week, we're going to have Ellen Hammaker from Utrecht University talking about choices in design and analysis of study change. And I hope to see many of you next week again. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for having me. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Iyad, for this nice presentation.
Thank you. It's been great fun. Great question and discussions.